Welcome, welcome to our audience and our virtual audience and our future audience. Welcome to the 2021 Sunstone Symposium, session 262, Garden Stakes of Zion, Guiding Mormon Communities to a New Definition of Self-Reliance. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There's more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. After the symposium, Sunstone staff will edit, polish, and re-upload all of this year's session videos to the Whova app. It'll take about 2 weeks for everything to become available, but once it is, every video will be available to watch and rewatch in the Whova app through the end of 2021. Please type any questions into the Whova app to be addressed during the Q&A, or if you're watching in person, we'll open the audience mic for questions at the end as time allows. About this presentation. In the face of the human-caused climate crisis, the Mormon conception of self-reliance needs to change. By reframing the self from human individual to all of creation and shifting the definition of reliance from preservation to sustainability, Mormons could still maintain a culture of preparedness while reconnecting with their neighbors, human and otherwise. One way to foster this change is through a grassroots handbook that guides LDS congregations through the theological discussions and physical work it takes to create and maintain community gardens. Today, I am pleased to introduce Emma Ramirez. She is a graduate student concurrently studying divinity at McCormick Theological Seminary, a Presbyterian school, and library science at Dominican University, a Catholic school. Emma and her wife, Grace, graduated together from BYU in 2019. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Cheryl. So my name is Emma Ramirez. My pronouns are she, her, and this is my little project. Hopefully I'm, here to present on this and kind of introduce the concept of this handbook because it doesn't exist yet, but I would like it to someday. And so if you're interested in contributing to something like this, we're going to need all the help we can get. So let's go through this project. So this came out of a class I took earlier this year called Environmental Leadership and Ministry. So I'm super grateful. I just want to acknowledge the professors for that class, Doctors Anna Case Winters and Ted Hebert. They're great environmental and theological scholars. And I also want to acknowledge this is a presentation about, expanding our sense of self, about collaborating with our neighbors, both human and otherwise. And so I do want to acknowledge that we are on land that traditionally was the home of the Shoshone, the Goshute, the Ute, and Paiute tribes who once lived and still live here. That we have 8 tribal neighbors within the boundaries of this state. And also I want to recognize the 42 endangered species, animal and plant that are just in Utah, let alone the world. So let's get started. Oh, this is we're learning technology. Okay, so I wanted to start by bringing up this talk called Sustainable Societies that Elder D. Todd Christofferson gave in October 2020. So 2020 was an interesting year, right? We were dealing with the pandemic. People were talking a lot about mutual aid societies. People were discussing systemic issues of racism. There's a lot of things going on. And sustainable societies is something that we needed to consider. And he started out his talk by referencing the 2015 United Nations, their agenda for 2030 for sustainable development. So by 2030, they wanted to accomplish these goals: no poverty, zero hunger, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, and decent work. A lot of these issues that people were talking about during the pandemic, right? But what was Elder Christofferson's solution to all these problems? Is surely our most fundamental and enduring service will be to teach and live by the truths inherent in God's great plan of redemption. So what this explicitly means, he put this, he very explicitly said that it's our own individual personal morality, our individual choices that will lead to these systemic changes that we need. And I just think that's a little short-sighted, but it comes from a long history of both Mormon, LDS, and American Christian values. So we need to consider where this privileging of personal choice and morality over the wider world comes from. So the dualism of the mind and body is a very common concept in Western religion, philosophy, etc. It came out of the Enlightenment period, where if you think of the classic quote from Descartes, I think, therefore I am. He's not saying I have a body, therefore I am, or I am breathing, or I am doing all these things in my body and existing in the world. It's I think, therefore I am. And so we often see the spirit or the brain or the mind as something higher than or more moral, more righteous than the physical carnal body. So we see this a lot. I do gotta say, so Mormonism does push back against this a bit, because we like to talk about how important our bodies are. They're a vital part of the plan of salvation. They're these wonderful creations, but we still privilege our spirits over the body in these few ways. So we think about spirit. So all things were created spiritually first. I think that's a wonderful, beautiful idea that we find in the book of Moses, that, the very earth itself has a spirit, and then we were created physically. I think that's a beautiful thing. A lot of times the way people read it is that because the spirit came first, the spirit is more important. The spirit is what's everlasting. The body, if we come over to here, it is a necessary part of the plan. President Nelson recently described it as a tabernacle for our spirits, right? So it's not it is something separate from our spirits. It is a separate part of who we are, important and integral, but it's still separate. Thinking about the earth, this verse from Doctrine and Covenants, all things which come of the earth are made for the benefit and use of man. This is a very, very common idea. And of course, we are blessed with all the abundance of the earth. But in other verses, you can consider how things were, the animals and the plants, they were created to fulfill their own measure of creation, not just to be tools that we use. Just taking a breath. And all this kind of combines into the concept of stewardship. Now, I don't want to diss on stewardship. It was an important concept for me when I was first thinking about how my Mormon and Christian identity should interact with environmentalism, right? Stewardship is this idea that we do not own our bodies, we do not own the earth, it belongs to God, but we are here to take care of it. And that is a wonderful thing, for people to kind of shift their mind away from exploitation towards service. But it's still privilege. It creates this hierarchy that we're very familiar with in the church, that God is at the top, then us, then creation, then the physical things. So the body and the earth are both physical things that need to be overcome. But things weren't always this way. So one of the things I love about Mormonism is the way that its early history is grounded very much in physical experience. So if we think about the first vision, so much of it focuses specifically on the physicality of Joseph, on the way, when Satan tried to stop him, it wasn't through his mind or his thoughts, but through the binding of his tongue. And when we see God and Jesus, two personages, The like definition of personage, if you look it up in the church resources, it's that it's a heavenly being with a body of flesh and blood. So these are vital aspects to the first vision, and a lot of people draw power from it. They base their testimony that this is the true church based on those physical experiences. We had the law of consecration, where one's fate depended specifically on the physical redistribution of resources. I won't bring up those whole verses, but they are very explicit that everyone needs to contribute, that things will be distributed fairly, and in order to take care of the poor and the needy, and that is part of what determines your place in the afterlife. And then sealing practices. This is like a little, maybe a little funky to think about, but I just want to highlight that salvation was also tied up in relationships with your whole community. It wasn't just about the sealing of a husband, a wife, and children. There are practices that have since been discontinued of the practice of sealing of adoption, where men would be sealed to other men as part of this family. It was a way to get salvation. And of course, polygamy, that was one of the reasons why, one of the reasonings given for it was that, these women needed ways to reach salvation. So obviously there's a lot of tension in there, but I think it's important to recognize the ways in which salvation was not just about you and your individual choices. And then I wanted to share this quote from Mormon Trees. It's an essay done by the Mormon historian Wallace Stegner in his book. This was back in 1942 when it was published. And he was talking about the wide preponderance of poplar trees that Mormons planted in Utah once they crossed over. And I just want to share it. I'm going to read it aloud. I'll try to speak slowly and clearly so that people can understand it. Institutions must have their art forms, their symbolic representations. And if the heavenward aspirations of medieval Christianity found their expression in cathedrals and spires, the more mundane aspirations of the Latter-day Saints may just as readily be discovered in the widespread plantings of Mormon trees. They look heavenward, but their roots are in the earth. The Mormon looked toward heaven, but his heaven was a heaven on earth, and he would inherit bliss in the flesh. I hold that idea very close to my heart, that heaven is something that we find on earth, that we create on earth, and that as we look towards God and towards the future, we have to stay grounded in the earth that we are a part of. So how did we lose all this? A lot of these practices, both the economic, the social, the religious practices were threatened by the US government due to the pressures and wanting to become a state and wanting to assimilate into this wider culture. The church gave up a lot of these practices. And this is where we are today. The shift has gone from our grounded, physical, communal experience of life. It's much more about individual. And when I say individual, I also extend that to the nuclear family. So person or their immediate family, their spiritual preservation. I have a few quotes here over the years. So we have from at the time, Elder Oaks, where he said, a 72-hour kit of temporal supplies may prove valuable for earthly challenges, but as the foolish virgins learn to their sorrow, a 24-hour kit of spiritual preparation is of greater and more enduring value. Okay, being a little harsh on our ladies. Let's go into Elder Cook in 2010, also referring to the same parable. Spiritual preparation must be acquired individually, drop by drop, and cannot be shared. So when we think about the ways that the church encourages service, that it encourages, building these 72-hour kits, preparing for disaster, rising to the occasion when something happens, to help other people. At the core of it, there's still this need for you to focus on your individual spiritual preservation. I pulled this quote from Pope Francis. This is from his encyclical Laudato Si in 2015. I highly recommend it. It's very long, but it's a beautiful piece. I had an example, I think, for our church of how a religious institution can really take a stand on these important systemic issues. So I pulled this quote. It says the current model, he's referring specifically to, our like capitalist society and kind of the way of the world. But I like to insert it instead of model. Let's think the current Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with its emphasis on success and self-reliance, does not appear to favor an investment in efforts to help the slow, the weak, or the less talented to find opportunities in life. So again, when we put such a focus on self-reliance, and when that self-reliance is, directed towards your individual spirituality, we miss out a lot on these other things that we should be doing as Christians. So self-reliance, again, not here to knock it. It can be a very helpful thing. If, I had some of you reply to my poll about the ways that self-reliance has been empowering and the ways that it has maybe been disheartening. And a lot of people talked about getting your finances in order. And that is, of course, something that greatly affects our physical experiences here on earth. So there's a lot of value to be had in, taking responsibility for your own life. But I think that down at the heart of the church's concept of self-reliance is this quote that comes from the introduction to the church welfare program. To provide in the Lord's way, we must develop our own self-reliance and then seek to help others become self-reliant. So put it another way, if you make a man a 72-hour kit, he'll survive one catastrophic event. But if you teach a man to make his own 72-hour kit, then he'll be able to fulfill his patriarchal duty and protect his family from any and all wars and rumors of wars you can ever imagine. So the goal, again, it's not about, I think this quote is, it just gets me. To provide in the Lord's way, we must seek our own self-reliance and then seek to help others become self-reliant. I don't know, it kind of makes me emotional. But we'll just get into it. Tired. Hope y'all are having a good time. So concepts of self-reliance, both in Mormonism and in wider American Christianity, often tie into Mormon ideas of the end times. So a lot of times we like to think of ourselves high and mighty because we don't subscribe to the idea of the rapture. People aren't going to disappear and all this stuff. But there are a lot of similarities between the rapture, as it's commonly thought of, and our conception of the second coming and the ways that self-reliance plays into them. So for both, it creates this us versus them mentality. Again, if we're trying to shift our perception of self, we need to recognize that it's not an us and a them, that we are all in this together, that we're all part of this earth and intimately affecting each other's physical experiences. There in both, there's these ideas of natural disasters and environmental degradation. I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of people who are excited when these horrible hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes happen because they're like, yes, finally, Jesus is on the way. And that, again, puts it into this mind. It's like, well, the people who died, that's over there. That's something separate. They're part of this greater plan, but here I am. I'm alive and I'm prepared and I'm ready to meet Jesus. And then even though we have a difference here in the rapture, we see that the righteous will be taken from the earth, right? That everyone else will be left behind. When the Mormon conception, the righteous will remain on the reborn earth. Now, I think this is a beautiful idea that the earth, like our physical bodies, will be resurrected, will be made whole, will be made healthy again. But with both of these, what it does is it takes away the responsibility from humans. It puts it all on God. So either God is going to take away all the people and the earth, it will be destroyed. So it doesn't matter if we try to save it. Or God's going to make the earth right again, so it doesn't matter if we save it, right? It takes away our sense of, like I said, responsibility, accountability. Again, it's something out of our hands. It's not a part of us. And whew, I'm doing all right. I just wanted to point out that the us versus them mentality gets really dangerous, and we see even the ways that it is developing schisms within Mormonism. So the example I was thinking of was earlier this year, when President Nelson got vaccinated and encouraged members to do the same, and people said, "Oh, this is proof. This is proof that the end is coming, that the church, has fallen." All these things, and I think that just reveals an ideology where people imagine that God needs you to be self-reliant because you are the only person that can be trusted. It's just you and God, and everybody else is out to get you. And so we have to make a shift. So this is something fascinating from, if you've read The Next Mormons by Jana Reese. She surveyed hundreds, thousands of current and former Mormons of all different generations. And one of the things is she asked them about how important these different societal issues were. And the environment did not crack the top 10 for any generation, not for current Mormons, not for former Mormons, none of that. So we see this huge lack of interest and concern over the issue. I have a quote here from Barbara Rossing, a theological scholar on this, and she says, "Environmental calamities should be the cause for Christian concern, but not prophetic excitement." So that's what I was referring to earlier, when people only care about these issues in the way that it calls to their spiritual journey rather than the physical experience of their neighbors. Okay, so if our problem is that people are not concerned about the environment, they're not concerned about these long-term effects, and all they're focused on is just taking care of themselves and their family and preparing for the end of the world, then what do we do? One thing I think of is that we need to reframe the idea of the self as all of creation. So we see me as, the earth is part of me. I am part of the earth. I am part of my ward. My family is part of this greater community. And shift from preservation, individual spiritual preservation, and preparing for disaster to sustainability, which, encourages this, a culture of, preparedness, of being ready for whatever comes next, but it's because you're putting in the work every day in order to connect with people, to connect with the land, and to make it the best place you can. So how do we, that's hard. How do we do that? My idea is that we create a Mormon style handbook on community gardens. Now, why community gardens? I have to thank my dad for this, who's in the audience here. So in his ward, they have 3 beautiful parks, and the neighborhood uses the parks for parties. I had, my wedding reception there, for these great events and moments of connection, for everybody in the neighborhood. But there's one park right behind my parents' house. It's kind of on an incline. You can't set up a bounce house on it. It doesn't get used a lot for these events, and so it sits empty most of the time. And a lot of people put a lot of money and a lot of work into watering that slightly inclined lawn. And one year, when it rained a bunch in May, as it tends to do here in the desert, they didn't end up having to use the sprinkler for that park, and for all of the parks, and ended up saving thousands of dollars for the neighborhood, along with thousands of gallons of water. And so my dad, he was like, we should be using this for something that actually matters, for something that's actually helpful for people. And he wants to start this community garden. But it's a hard thing to do. He could go out there and stick a shovel in the ground, and like I could go and try to help him and get very tired very fast, as I am right here on stage. And we wouldn't get a lot done. So in order to build a community garden, you have to have a community. And so by giving them, why community gardens? It's because we need a long-term project that is going to hold our attention, that's going to keep us engaged and change not just our physical habits, but our thoughts and our very theology. So why a handbook? Basically, what I want to do is to make this idea not scary to people. If you're trying to shift the theology of this huge organization of these people who are very, have very strong ideas about the world and the way that it works, if we can introduce it in a format that feels comfortable, that they recognize from church, that guides, all other aspects of life. I was looking through, and in the church handbook, it like tells you how to dispose of your expired temple recommends. I think I threw mine in the trash, which is probably incorrect. And the difference between a ward music chairman and a ward music director, who knew? If people are willing to pay attention to this detail, because it comes in the form of a handbook passed down through the authority, then think of what we could introduce to their brains, to their minds, if we also offered a handbook. And I love this quote here that I have. This is also, again, from Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. He says, culture is more than what we have inherited from the past. It is also, and above all, a living, dynamic, and participatory present reality, which cannot be excluded as we rethink the relationship between human beings and the environment. So again, we are asking people to make these huge shifts in how they think, how they act, everything. And so we cannot disregard the culture. We need to use it to our advantage. And so let's get a handbook done. Okay, I'm super proud of my title. Please all enjoy. This is the full title of the hypothetical handbook, Garden Stakes of Zion, How to Nourish and Strengthen a Mormon Community Garden. It's wonderful. It doesn't exist yet, but again, I'm hoping here to see, if you will help me make it happen. So I want to take you through some of the examples here. I kind of, I based it off of our typical Sunday school manuals, our yearly guidelines for how all the classes are run, to give that familiar feeling. So we have a calendar. As we make a garden, this is something that will be redone year after year. Now we get tired of the same Sunday school lessons happening year after year after year. But in this case, this is something that nature requires of us. We have to show up continually. We have to come back the next year, even when it's hard. And so it'll have this calendar set up to help encourage continued participation. There will be individual exercises. So kind of like your personal progress. You go home. If every person participating in the garden has to go and sit down and think about something, then they're going to have an opportunity to shift their own thinking on their own. And then those individual exercises lead into communal exercises. So you come to your garden meeting, once a week, once a month, and everybody talks about, here's our plan for the garden this month. And also here's some theological discussion that goes along with it. For the scriptures, I'm really interested in including in this book a combination of Mormon, of other religious scriptures, and of secular texts. As we expand our definition of self, we can expand our definition of the truth and who has it. We have a lot to learn about the environment, about our connection to the world, from all types of people. And this is one way to include it side by side with scriptures from Doctrine and Covenants or the Book of Mormon. Devotionals, I want to include meditations on what it means to be in and of the world, right? We need to change that. And this is something I especially imagine if we can get lots of people to contribute their own experiences, their own thoughts and ruminations on the subject. This is a wonderful opportunity to expose people to different ideas. And then finally, practical tips, because, we actually want a garden out of this at the end. We actually want people to be able to plant and do the hard work and create something beautiful. So we're going to go through a little bit of the exercises. It's Sunday school, got time. So I'm going to engage y'all in some of these. We probably won't go through all of them just because of time, but we're going to have fun. So this is an example that I wrote for my class back at the beginning of this year. An example of something you would find in the handbook. So this, I was imagining in the month of June, you would have an exercise like this. In the season of growth, may we remember the things that are lost and may yet be lost. On June 27th, 1844, Joseph and Hiram Smith were martyred, marking a great loss to their families and the church as a whole. This is something familiar to people, right? Everybody knows this story. Exactly 111 years later, on June 27th, 1955, the first presidency instructed stake presidents that Native American children in Utah may legally be removed from their homes and sent to live with white LDS families through the Indian Placement Program. This too marked familial loss and destruction of life. And so we're introducing something a little, maybe a little new, maybe a little different, drawing these connections that people might not otherwise make. And so then the exercise, apologize for the amount of text on here, but consider how it would feel to be so suddenly separated from your family, your community, and your land. Think about who or what is being separated today from their families, communities, and lands. Come up with a population that is being lost and how you may help slow or stop the destruction. So I want you to think about that in your mind as we go along. Just think about it personally, because I will have you do a little discussion. So you can start thinking about that and get ready to share your ideas with others. Okay, I don't know if anybody has their scripture app on here, but if you want to stretch your legs and come up to the microphone, I have a few scriptures that need to be read. So I'm getting a feel. Come on, don't be shy. My parents are very dutifully helping out. Mostly give me a chance to catch my breath. Yes, I long ago deleted the app, so I understand. All right, does someone have that first one, Ezekiel 34?
Sure.
Do you want to come up to the microphone, Dad, so that it can be caught for the online audience?
Indeed. 2 through 4?
Yep, 2 through 6. Sorry.
Oh, 2 through 6. So this is Ezekiel 34, 2 through 6. So, son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophecy. Is it prophecy or prophesy? We got to ask.
Prophesy.
Okay, thank you. Prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord God unto the shepherds, woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks? Yea, eat the fat, and ye eat the fat, and ye clothe you with the wool. Ye kill them that are fed, but ye feed not the flock. The diseased have not yet, have ye not strengthened? Neither have ye healed that which is sick. Neither have you bound up that which is broken. Neither have you brought again that which was driven away. Neither have ye sought that which is lost. But with force and with cruelty ye have ruled them. And they were scattered because there is no shepherd. And they became meat to all beasts of the field when they were scattered. My sheep wandered through all the mountains and upon every hill, every high hill. Yea, my flock was scattered upon all the face of the earth, and none did search or seek after them.
Thank you. So there's that verse. And then the other verse I included, that's the eat, drink, and be merry verse, classic verses from 2nd Nephi. Again, kind of putting it in a different context. So it's discussion time. So if you've got a few people around you, or if you're online, maybe putting things in the Hoove app. And I want us to think about those scriptures where the shepherds are tasked with taking care of the sheep, and instead they feed themselves. They exploit the sheep that they are meant to take care of, and the sheep suffer all these sorts of afflictions while the shepherds eat, drink, and be merry. And so I want you to discuss in your just little groups on the app how, let's see, there's a lot of questions, so we'll just do one. Thanks for being patient. So I want you to discuss who the community, and you can frame that how you like, who the community may have mistreated, neglected, and ignored. What cries does God hear on their behalf? So as we think of the earth, as we think of our neighborhoods, who is crying out to God because of the ways that we have neglected or mistreated them? I'm going to give, let's do 4 minutes until 4:35. Turn to your neighbor, type in the app, type away. I'll be checking on things. And just think about that.
One more explanation.
Exactly what you're doing. This sentence here, uncover who the community may have mistreated, neglected, and ignored. What cries does God hear on their behalf? Who's crying out to God? Who is being mistreated?
I find myself thinking about how humans, like, it's easy, we're kind of culturally trained to mainly think of just the well-being of other humans, but we don't think a lot about, like, say, the livestock that eat, because somebody else doing it in some far building that we're not far. At least I'm not. I don't know if y'all keep livestock, but I don't. Or like,
So you see cage-free eggs, right? So we know that those animals should probably be treated.
yeah, I mean,
Affordable eggs. Because you're paying a premium for somebody to take better care of it.
yeah, I don't even think that you necessarily abandon. I feel like you care more about how that is raised. I think, and a lot of good, non-monoculture gardening practices can include, animals as part of the process. You have animals that eat some of the food and eat some of the bugs that might be trying to also eat your food. And they have their ways in which turns into fertilizer for plants, and it's kind of a cycle that farm animals can be a part of, but they're not really part of the cycle of their own.
Yeah, the more roots into these products, the more abstract it becomes. The easier it becomes to sort of use it to simplify.
Outside of our money.
Right. Yeah, and I would see how that complicated. Because I get farmers who check. Well, why not just, I don't know, why just coffee growers and simple South America? Why don't we have the same sort of standard, a livable wage, decent farming conditions for it's just, I think coffee is probably the consumers who rely on that. Become tired, well, social media, see things in the world. Well, who the fuck buy regular? Well, let's spread that same mentality across the whole spectrum of food production. That's where you get it. One of the nation's hospital. I'm for a long time. What is this?
About 1 more minute, you can finish up your conversation. All right. I hope you had enjoyable conversations. I heard little snippets of it. And this is something, I mean, imagine if we had conversations like this at church, right? And I think by framing it like this, where we read a scripture and we talk about, ideas that we thought of beforehand, and we put it in these terms, I think we can get really valuable conversations happening. And I'm going to skip through a little bit of these things just for time. If I could get a volunteer to come up to the microphone and read this beautiful prayer that was written by Luca Romney in their book, Our Body and Eco-Queer Theology. That would be great. Isaac, yeah.
A prayer for when a life is taken by Luca Romney. Dear God, I have taken a life of yours to feed myself. I promise to use it well and righteously, to feed my strength and peace and love in you. I will waste as little as possible and give whatever remains back to the earth. Amen.
Thank you. And so this is how I imagine devotionals going in the book, is that we have maybe something like this, a poem, a prayer, a little snippet of something, and then along with it, we have perhaps an essay written by someone. So I wrote this: we are blessed with a gospel of abundance. The atonement of Christ covers us all, and the love of God is greater than we can imagine. Similarly, the earth is abundant with its gifts, blessing all with sustenance and beauty. And then I included this quote from a book that's actually out there that you can buy at Benchmark Books. It's Mormons and Mother Nature by Sylvia Wilcox. She says, but what are we to do with the bounty, with this abundance that I talked about? We are to gather up what is left over so it is not wasted. We are to preserve or share it with those in need so that nothing be lost. The Lord gives us much, but we are not justified in being wasteful. So this is an example of something that you might see, just in the book, ways to shift people's thoughts. Let's get through those. So now what? If we want to make a book, I need your help. We think of books as a solitary project with an author, maybe two authors. But just like, we're expanding our ideas of self. So I can't write this book alone. We're going to need people who have actual gardening expertise. I don't actually know a lot about gardens. I'm just excited by the opportunities here. So I need some help with people who know how to garden. We need people who know about community organizing. This handbook, it's something different for Mormon wards, a different form of organization. It's not coming from the hierarchy, from the top down. We need to be able to teach and empower people to do this work on their own and within themselves. We need writers and artists. Like I said, I would love if these devotionals were written from all different perspectives, from different people. If we had these, different facets of our self as creation, right? And then publishers. Somebody needs to print it. So if you are interested, you're in the audience, online, if you're viewing this later in the year, I set up this email. It's just gardenstakesofzion@gmail.com. It's going to be open, you can watch this until the end of the year. So if you're interested, if you have any ideas for this, you just want to chat more about it, feel welcome to contact me at this email here. So to end, I'm just gonna finish up, and then we can do a little conversation, little Q&A if y'all like. But I wanted to include this quote from the book Braiding Sweetgrass. This is my #1 recommendation for a book if you're interested in these ideas of learning from and reconnecting with our neighbors, human and otherwise. Robin Wall Kimmerer, she is a classically trained botanist as well as a Native American woman, and she brings these powerful ideas of how we combine our scientific knowledge, indigenous wisdom, and the teachings of the earth into one. And so this quote, I think it really appeals especially to us as restorationists in Mormonism. Restoration is a powerful antidote to despair. Restoration offers concrete means by which humans can once again enter into positive, creative relationship with the non-human world, meeting responsibilities, both material and spiritual. What is the first vision, if not this, if not re-entering into positive, creative relationship and meeting the responsibilities that we have in this world as church members, as Christians, of meeting the responsibilities, both material and spiritual. So here's some of the resources I quoted and used for this presentation. You're welcome, I recommend all these books. And yeah, we can turn it over to discussion, to questions. If you would like to say anything, please come up to the microphone so that the people online and in future you watching the recordings can hear you.
So I guess I have a comment because this is the quote from Braiding Sweetgrass reminds me of a quote from an ecologist writer that kind of got me into ecology, Murray Bookchin. And I'll paraphrase it because I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, humans in many aspects of how we behave now, we seem to be like parasites. We're like preying off the natural world where we end up destroying things with pollution. But in ecology, a species that might be a parasite in one place where it's maybe an invasive species, in another place, it might just be a helpful part of the whole ecosystem. And I think it's good to be able to imagine what could humans do as creatures that are part of aiding other creatures in the ecosystem, instead of having this attitude of competition everywhere. I don't think that's a good model for ecology. Instead, we should be looking at how do these different creatures cooperate together. Trees grow spaces for birds. They're not in competition with birds, they're just working together. And so it's that's looking at that part of nature that is full of cooperation, I think is a good model for how humans can be, part of this cooperative input into the whole ecosystem and all these other creatures.
Nice. I love that. The thing that stands out from that quote is, talking about how something that's a parasite and harmful in one situation can be helpful in another. And maybe for humans, that's, our mindset. If we think and act one way, it's going to be harmful. But if we think and act another way, it's going to be helpful. All right. So we just need to make that shift. Anyone else?
Just a quick question. When you talked about having quotes from different religions and as well as Mormon and secular, even though this is a LDS handbook proposal, is the idea to incorporate other parts of the community, other churches and members of the community?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I quoted a few times Pope Francis. I'm obsessed with Laudato Si. I cannot stress this enough. And there are a lot of examples outside of the church of, institutional churches, of individual, religious individuals speaking on these matters. So we have to include those sources. I think one, just because, like I talked about, we're expanding our idea of ourself, right? We're not contained to the limits of a single church, but also there's maybe not enough material within the Mormon church, within the sphere. And so we have to rely on the wisdom and knowledge that's come before from wherever it may be from. So yes, I'd love to include pieces from all sorts of religions.
I just had a question. I know this would probably be a little bit more far out, but my question is, where do you see this leading to? Say the garden gets done and it's a huge success and it spreads all over the world and things like that. What would the next step be? What would the next big project be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess what I would like, in the most simplest of terms, is this just to last. The most simple thing is, because I mean, I say it's the most simple, but it takes a lot of work to keep something like this going. And so that's what I'm really looking for, is a long-term shift in the way that church members think about the earth, and think about environmental issues. And so honestly, if people can just do this for not just a year, but for 5 years, for 10 years, if they can spread it on then to another ward, if they can, I think a big challenge with the project is, even just looking at the United States, we have a lot of different climates and a lot of different way, growing things. If we can even just spread this to create a lasting change for more people, honestly, that's like the big goal for this project. Would I theoretically like to see institutional support for environmental issues? Yes. Would I like to see our own version of Laudato Si? Yes. If you go to Bristlecone Firesides out there, Madison's in the back of the room, they rewrote the proclamation, the family proclamation to the world, kind of addressing these environmental issues. If we had something like that would be wonderful. But the real goal here is just to make that lasting change in people's, lives long term.
Well, it's wonderful to see that you're quoting original sources there, Dr. Cummins 104, and where we are now. We have those two quotes from general authorities here in the 2010s. You can kind of see we've drifted over time. But I really like what you're talking about. It's really what I think the church is about. But we are at our root.
Yeah.
And don't want to disappoint you, but quoting outside sources wouldn't be original. Over Tanner in the 1950s, if you're familiar with his book, the Sunday school book, he quoted outside sources in the Sunday school book. So
No, I love it.
As we go forward on this, I think there's going to be a couple of things we'll run across. People who are like, oh, I didn't realize that. But then probably more tricky is those who are sitting out there listening to the lesson. I realize this, but I'm keeping it down. And how are we going to handle that for people like it's in their consciousness, and what they're doing is I'm just sort of putting it aside. I'm not dealing with it. I know we should be doing this or this kind of thing. And I think for people like, oh my gosh, to wake up, I miss them at the blind spot. They'll thank us. But for those, and I myself, there are things like, oh, do I want to speak up on this? Do I hold my tongue? I have a history of not holding my tongue, and it's gotten me in trouble. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's important with these big systemic issues, especially like with the environment, right? Individuals are not to blame for the situation that we're in. And so if it's difficult to grasp for some people, like I 100% understand that. If it's hard, like if your daily life does not allow you to participate in things like this, or to, be able to, whether you can't afford it or you don't have the time or the space or the resources, right? I don't hold that against anyone. What I hope is that people who are maybe already interested in these things will get it started. And then maybe the next year you get people who were like, oh, I was busy last summer, but I can help this year. And then maybe the third year you get people, oh, well, I really liked, the pie that they made, from the fresh fruit. So I'd like to contribute. And the next year you get more and more people. I think, it's not going to be for everyone. But, that's not a reason to not try and to not start somewhere. Because I really think that with these long-term projects, like it just takes time and seeing this being done repeatedly over and over and over to, stick in the minds for those people who it might be more of a challenge.
Emma, thank you. I love your passion for this subject. It's fabulous. I feel like we have, in the LDS Church, lost a lot of our community spirit. We're losing programs that foster community spirit, and it can be very lonely sometimes. And this is a marvelous way to address the problem while being aware of the earth. And my experience with community gardens, when I lived in Texas, once I knew of a community garden because it was large and beautiful and many people were involved in it, but I was not involved. And one year, one of the participants invited me to, they were going out of town in August, and invited me to partake of their bounty while they were gone. And I got hooked on community gardens. I got to know so many people in my community, and I loved what was happening there, and I enjoyed the fruit, the produce, and so it was wonderful. And this has been a fabulous introduction to the subject. I hope many people will listen to this. Thank you so much.
Oh,
And
thank you.
let's show our appreciation for Emma. And this brings this session to a close.